within a subjectivity are created, like, because it's a subjectivity, and I'm saying that a subjectivity is an infinite space the same way that you define a time frame to be an infinite space, or a spectrum to be an infinite space, or like the space from 0 to 1, or just the space within an individual. And keep in mind that within an individual, I keep describing different levels of individuality, like the world or America or just you as an individual. And because the truth is, you exist as one thing in all these different levels at one time. You exist as one thing as an individual, and you exist as one thing as part of the individual that is America, and then at a different, even higher level, as part of one thing from the world, and then at a higher level, one thing at the universe. But you exist in all of these things at one time, and all of these levels are relative to each other the same way that time is, because time would be one thing but described at all these different levels, meaning all these different measurements. But I'm just describing, again, the framework for a space between 0 and 1, and like the kinds of I'm describing the interactions that take place within an infinite framework, because when describing the way that you exist as an individual at all these different levels at one time, you're describing relativity and the way that all your levels relate to each other. But all those relations are done within as one thing. They can only be defined as one thing, or one unitary measurement, like as one individual at this level, or one country, or one world, or one universe. And they all have a different unit of measure for one. So they describe a space between 0 and 1. And ultimately, the space between 0 and 1 that contains all the possible subspectrums 0 to 1 that you can create, like where as individuals, meaning the subspectrum as you as an individual, within the giant spectrum, one universe, like one individual would be a subspectrum within one state, would it be a subspectrum in one country, which would be a subspectrum in one world, which would be a subspectrum in the 0 to 1 space that constitute the spectrum that is a single universe. But ultimately, the single universe contains all of these ones, and it is the subjectivity of the universe that contains. It's the subjectivity of the universe that contains the definitions that we create here. But it's like that is the subjector, that it's creates all these other subjectivities, all these different levels of subjectivity. But like the world exists at a level of subjectivity, but it is a subjectivity because within the space you can create divisions or subjections. You can create subjectors, things that divide and categorize. Because authorities are the authority on different groups, and are the authority to differentiate one thing from another. And they're an authority, and they're a border. They go around an entire space, and they designate an entire space. But they designate an entire space as sectioned off from another space, is what an authority is, because an authority deems that it has authority over a certain space. So like the subjective space is ultimately described by authority, and different authorities can be created as manifestations within a subjective space. And that's only self-explanatory, because subjectivity is subjection and is authorities. Any manifestation within subjectivity is an authority, but it's just a certain, like an authority constitutes a single space within a subjective space, which is the same since it's designating a certain space and is a specific authority, because the manifestation of subjectivity is going to be one manifestation out of all the other manifestations, or all the other subjectors or authorities that constitute subjectivity, because subjectivity is like counted, the elements of it are authorities because they're subjectors. They're just different levels of these authorities. But as long as you're considering that they're all different elements, they have different names. So each authority has a different name. But since an authority is an authority and is a border and is a circle and surrounds a space, and therefore it being a border, and the way to describe the authority is to describe every instance of the border. You're describing something that's like a wave, because to include every instance of a border as one authority, you're describing something that's infinite, and really a division or an authority is infinite like that. So it's but it's a space that you're describing out of a larger space. You're describing one authority, or like a subspectrum, or it's like a subspectrum within a larger spectrum is what an authority is, because an authority does describe infinite elements and does describe a spectrum. But as long as you're calling it an authority, you're just calling it, You're calling it time frame or a spectrum or space between 0 and 1 that exists within a larger space between 0 and 1, a larger spectrum and a larger subjectivity. It's subject to something larger. It's all, subjectivity is the word that connects all of that. But within a subjective space, every single element is relative as defined, as long as you're defining the exact definition for whatever subjective space, whatever level that you're defining it to be.